Hello everyone, welcome back to 8-Bit Politics. Today we're going to be talking about the different factions that exist in the video game industry. And I'm sure you guys see like a whole bunch of things on the screen right now and you're like, what the hell does all this mean? Today's presentation is pretty much trying to introduce these concepts to you guys, because I'm going to be making a whole series analyzing the entire industry, why it is the way it is, and describing these different factions and comparing them with one another is probably the best way to approach explaining the way the industry works, because I feel like there's a lot of misinformation or just blatant ignorance about how the industry works. So I want this to serve as kind of like a series that best explains why things are the way they are, how things are the way they are, and all that. So I think the best way to start off is, what the hell is a faction, right? That's probably the best way to start off. So we're going to start off with that. So a faction, the Merriam-Webster definition of a faction, is a party or group that is often contentious or self-seeking. So another way of, I guess, a way of rewording that would be that factions, they're self-serving groups. They will promote their own goals and interests above all else. So they don't really necessarily believe in a greater good or anything like that. They're really more focused on doing whatever it takes to accomplish their certain goals and interests. And they will compete with one another for the most influence, but often you will see factions working together if their goals and interests are aligned with one another, if they're compatible with one another, or if they feel like working with this group will make them better equipped to accomplish these goals and interests. And again, I'm just briefly describing these things. I'm going to be more in depth later on, so if you're still a little lost, no problem. This is just trying to introduce these concepts to you guys, so you guys understand what the hell I'm talking about when I make future videos on this. So I think, if you're still a little bit lost, I think the best way of explaining it would be politics. You have different political parties and interest groups whose goals and interests are adversarial to one another, and they want the most political influence so that their policy agenda is accomplished. A good example would be when it comes to political parties. Obviously, you have the Democrats and Republicans that have different partisan interests that they want accomplished. They want the most political influence. They want the most seats in government. So they are going to try to accomplish their goals and interests by pretty much trying to undermine the other party and trying to make the other party look bad. Because if the other party looks good, then there's really no reason for their party to regain power. So I think political parties, again, I'm not really going to dive too much into politics and open up that can of worms, really. The channel's called 8-Bit Politics, but what I mean by 8-Bit Politics is the politics of technology in the video game industry, not necessarily like real politics. Although I am very knowledgeable in that field, I do not really want to get into that in this. So that's probably a good way of explaining factions. Another way would be in the private sector. You have, one big faction, or corporate CEOs. Their interest is to be as profitable as possible, while you have labor unions that stand up for workers' rights, and they promote the interests of the worker as opposed to the corporation as a whole. So you often have executives going against labor union, people in charge of labor unions. They're often at odds with one another, negotiating wages and all that. So that's another good example of factions. But when we look at large industries, the film industry, and obviously the video game industry, these huge industries worth billions upon billions of dollars, they obviously require multiple factions, and each of these factions serve a different purpose. So again, we're going to get a little bit more into that very shortly. But 8 general factions, they exist in the video game industry, and we're going to be going over that right now. So these are the 8 different factions that can be identified in the industry, each serving different purposes, different functions, and in turn having different goals and interests. Usually, sometimes they work together, but again, we'll get more into that in the future. So first we have publishers. They're responsible for, pretty much their main responsibility is not only financing projects but promoting them, advertising and all that. That's pretty much what the publishers are responsible for doing. So for example, with EA, DICE is the developer, but EA is the publisher. They're responsible for funding the game because games cost a lot of money to make. So a lot of developers require publishers to publish their game, and in turn, fund their projects, promote the project, advertise the project, and that's basically the main function of publishers. And then investors, obviously, publishers need money to finance. The money doesn't come out of thin air, so a lot of these publishers use investors to secure funding for these projects. They provide capital to the publishers in exchange for making more money in the long run. So let's say you buy shares of Electronic Arts, EA, Activision, Ubisoft. These are publicly traded huge corporations. Investors invest in these companies. They give them capital, so that's how the publishers benefit. But how the investors benefit is that they want higher returns in the future. They expect the stock price to go up over time. So that's how investors are very important in the video game industry, so that's why I included them. They have a huge influence on the way the video game industry works right now. And of course, we will get into that in the future, in future presentations. Developers, they pretty much use the funds provided by publishers to create projects. I know a lot of times publishers and developers are often the same, especially with indie studios, but this really mostly applies to AAA, to major corporations, to these AAA studios that are worth billions upon billions of dollars, not necessarily these indie studios, right? But we will talk about them in the future and how indie developers and how they play into the industry as well. And then number 4, we have hardware manufacturers. They pretty much, their purpose in the industry is to provide the platform to deliver the product to the consumer. So I guess the easiest way of explaining this is, let's say Call of Duty is on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, PC, right? The hardware manufacturers are responsible. They pretty much allow publishers and developers to release their finished product to the consumer. Like that's the platform that consumers play the game on. So if PlayStation, Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo are pretty much the big 3 hardware manufacturers in the industry. This really applies mostly to console, because when it comes to PC, hardware manufacturers like AMD and Nvidia really don't have as much influence on the development of games, although they do have obviously huge influence because they provide the hardware. But really, when it comes to certain guidelines, for a game to be released on the platform, because consoles are a more closed platform than PC, hardware manufacturers are a very important faction in the video game industry, because they set rules, they have certain guidelines, and of course, when it comes to consoles, they have certain hardware limitations that developers and publishers must realize and try to work around in order for that platform in order for a game to be released on that platform, basically. Because a lot of times, especially with consoles, with the PlayStation and Xbox, these consoles have huge install bases. So in order for a project to be really profitable, they have to really work around the guidelines, the physical limitations, and the guidelines set by the hardware manufacturers in order for their game to be successful. right? Because if a game, let's say if a game misses PlayStation 4, if a game misses Xbox One, the game is obviously going to make a lot less money as an exclusive or as a non-multi-platform game. They obviously want a game to be available on as many platforms as possible. So that's why hardware manufacturers are important. Retailers are also very important. They directly sell the finished product to the consumer. So they're pretty much the middleman between the consumer and the hardware manufacturer or the finished product, pretty much. So what retailers do is they are the ones that sell the game directly to you. So think of GameStop, but obviously over time, 4 and 5 have kind of merged together. So you've seen hardware manufacturers becoming retailers themselves by having the PlayStation Store, by having the Xbox Store, Nintendo eShop, and of course with PC gaming, you really retailers have always really been the dominant faction compared to hardware manufacturers, because they're really the ones, because PC is such an open platform. Like there's not one company that owns the entire market. So retailers obviously play a more vital role in the PC market than in the console market. But in the console market, hardware manufacturers often assume the role of retailers. So obviously we're obviously going to go more into the what it means when certain factions are merged together and what that means. But because physical retail like GameStop still exists pretty strongly in 2018, I know it's really been declining over the years, but because it still exists, they're still worth distinguishing from one another, because they do often serve different functions. So that's why I'm going to keep them separate. And then you have consumers. They're obviously the ones that purchase the product. They're the ones that really put the most money into the industry. They're the ones that buy the games. They're the ones that the publishers and the investors and everyone's trying to is pretty much where they all get their money from, really, because investors, they expect a return from their game. They expect a return from their investment. They expect the game to do well, and that obviously requires more investment from the consumer in order for them to make a profit. And obviously, publishers want to please investors because they want to continue receiving investments into their company so they can better finance these huge projects. So obviously, this is just me trying to explain this in the most basic way to you. I think it'll be a lot better when I go more in depth. But just to finish these off, government, they're the ones that regulate the product. Very important in certain places, not so important in other ones, like in the United States. Government is not really as important, but in places like China, it obviously really is important. And then you have media. They influence public opinion on the product. So media obviously plays a very vital role in how successful a game is, because especially with their review systems, if a game gets totally bombed in the reviews, someone's less likely to buy a game than if it gets 9 out of 10s, 10 out of 10s, is critically acclaimed. So the media plays a very vital role in the video game industry, so they're also very important to talk about. So then we're going to, just to finish this off, we're just going to talk about another thing that is worth mentioning is sub-factions. So sub-factions are pretty much factions that exist within a faction, and they pretty much compete amongst themselves for the most influence. So just go over a list of a few of the factions that we just talked about. We have the media that we just talked about. So with the media, you have old versus new media, right? Which would be the dedicated games journalists with the fancy degrees. They got the bachelor's degrees, even master's degrees, some of them. And they're very well connected with people in the industry. Just compared to your average person like me, YouTuber, independent content creator, that are really, honestly, like at this point, independent content creators have more influence than the dedicated games journalists. And that's, I think, because they're really trying to struggle to stay relevant in 2018, when anybody can just make videos and talk about things and report on things. these websites like IGN and GameSpot, Kotaku, Polygon, they're really struggling to maintain their influence. So that's why you really see like a clash between dedicated games journalists and YouTubers. That's pretty much the heart of the conflict. I know there's obviously a lot of political implications. You have a lot of people in the mainstream or in the old media, the old guard media, supporting certain progressive, diversity kind of things, and then you have YouTubers, independent content creators, a lot of them kind of objecting to that, objecting to the diversity. Like a good example would be Battlefield 5, kind of the clash between the two, because again, they have different, while they're obviously their goal, like their ultimate goal and interest, like their interest is to influence the opinion of people, is to influence public opinion. That's what the entire media, like everyone in the media, that's what their goal is. But different sub factions in the media have different ways of obtaining that. So obviously the old media wants to maintain relevancy, while the new media, they have pretty much, I think you know what I'm saying at this point. I'm going to be more in depth of this in the future. I'm not going to try to overcomplicate things. You pretty much know what I'm saying with that. And then with publishers, you have indie studios trying to compete with the big AAA studios that, you know, they put millions and millions of dollars into advertising, while the indie studios don't really have much money when it comes to marketing. They have lower budgets, so they try to use that lower budget and they try to compete with the big studios for recognition, for influence, and all that. And then manufacturers, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo, obviously, their interests are not always aligned with one another. Again, they're competitors with each other, so they're going to have different goals and interests. And again, we'll talk more about that in the future. And then consumers, you have PC versus console gamers. There's a different sub factions with consumers, because you have a lot of PC gamers and console gamers that really don't see eye to eye on a lot of things. They have different goals and interests. They have different demands, right? As consumers, PC gamers and console gamers are very different in the way that they play games and the way that they consume games. So they obviously, especially since many games are multi-platform, PC consumers and console consumers try to compete with one another kind of to get the most influence, so that their goals and their interests are seen seen through by the publishers, and that the finished product is a better reflection of their wants and their desires and what they want in a video game. Because when it comes to PC and console gamers, it could be very different sometimes, especially when it comes to hardware. You have PC gamers that have some of them have the most expensive hardware, but with a lot of AAA games that are being released, with a lot of multi-platform games being released, you see a thing where they, like, I think Watch Dogs is probably the best way to explain this, where the game looks beautiful at E3 2012, and then when the finished product looks so much less than what it was originally, and they feel like it has to do a lot with consoles holding PC games back. So that's a good way of explaining the different sub-factions among consumers and how they try to compete with for the most influence, because PC gamers feel that their wants and desires should be seen more than console gamers, because they have hardware that's capable of running games at incredible frame rates, at incredible graphics, but at the same time, publishers also want to cater to console gamers, which have such a huge install base. And then with retailers, you have digital and physical retailers often clashing with each other. You have physical retailers like GameStop trying to keep up with digital distribution. And of course, you also have digital retailers, especially in PC gaming. You have Steam and the Epic Game Store, and Origin, and all those trying to compete with one another, obviously to gain the most influence, to get the most business, the most customers. So those are the best 5 examples I can come up with sub-factions. So I just thought that was worth mentioning. And again, these 8 factions. If I seemed a little bit vague to you guys, I'm going to try to explain these more in depth. I'm going to try to analyze these further in future videos, future presentations. But this is just an introduction to what a faction is, what the different factions are, and what each faction, what their purpose is, pretty much. So that's going to be it for today. Should be interesting. Should be a very interesting series. It should be a very fun series for me. And yeah, I'm looking very much forward to future presentations, and I hope you guys are too. Thank you.